September 8, 1944. Near Liège, Belgium, German Field Marshal Walter Model was confronting a problem that no amount of battlefield skill could easily solve. Only weeks earlier, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. German commanders expected a difficult retreat. They expected fierce armored battles, overwhelming air attacks, and constant pressure from advancing Allied armies. What they did not expect was the speed. Every day, Allied spearheads seemed to appear farther east. American tanks pushed forward. Mechanized infantry followed close behind. Artillery units relocated with astonishing efficiency. Entire divisions seemed capable of moving almost without pause. German intelligence officers searched for an explanation. The answer was not hidden inside a new tank design or a secret weapon. It was moving along the roads. Reconnaissance pilots reported endless columns of trucks stretching across northern France. Military police directed traffic around the clock. Convoys moved day and night. Some roads appeared dedicated almost entirely to supply vehicles. Many of those trucks carried a single cargo: fuel. To German commanders, the scale was difficult to comprehend. A modern army consumed staggering quantities of gasoline and diesel fuel. Tanks required it. Trucks required it. Half-tracks required it. Aircraft depended on it. Every mile of advance increased demand. Historically, fuel shortages had slowed countless military offensives, yet the Allies seemed able to keep moving. Behind every American armored column stood an enormous logistical machine, feeding the advance with millions of gallons of fuel. While German units increasingly struggled to fill their tanks, Allied forces were creating a transportation network unlike anything previously seen in warfare. Some German officers eventually reached a troubling conclusion. The tanks themselves were dangerous, but the real threat was the fuel convoy behind them. Because an army without fuel stops, an army with fuel can keep changing history. For Germany, fuel was never merely a logistical concern. It was a strategic vulnerability that existed long before the first shots of the Second World War were fired. Unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, Germany possessed only limited domestic petroleum resources. German planners understood that modern mechanized warfare depended on enormous quantities of fuel, yet the nation lacked sufficient natural oil reserves to sustain a prolonged conflict. To compensate, Germany invested heavily in synthetic fuel production. Companies such as IG Farben developed processes that converted coal into liquid fuel. Throughout the 1930s, the Nazi government poured resources into these facilities, hoping they would reduce dependence on imported oil. Initially, the strategy appeared successful. During the early years of the war, synthetic fuel plants and oil imports from sources such as Romania helped sustain German military operations. Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union consumed enormous quantities of fuel, but supplies remained adequate. As the war expanded, however, the situation deteriorated. The German Army, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine all competed for the same limited resources. Every new tank division, every bomber mission, and every naval operation increased demand. By 1943, fuel shortages were becoming more noticeable across the German war machine. Then came the Allied strategic bombing campaign. American and British air forces increasingly targeted synthetic fuel plants, refineries, storage facilities, and transportation networks. These attacks struck at one of Germany's most critical weaknesses. Production began to fall. Distribution became more difficult. Fuel reserves shrank. The consequences reached every branch of the military. Tank crews received less training. Aircraft remained grounded. Mechanized units faced restrictions on movement. Commanders were forced to make difficult decisions about where scarce fuel should be allocated. By 1944, Germany was fighting a modern industrial war. while suffering a growing energy crisis. At the very moment German fuel supplies were collapsing, the Allies were preparing to demonstrate what unlimited access to fuel could achieve on the battlefield. And nowhere would that contrast become clearer than in the vast oil empire powering the American war effort. While Germany struggled to secure enough fuel for its military, the United States faced the opposite problem. America possessed so much oil that the challenge was not finding fuel. It was transporting it efficiently to the places where it was needed. Before the war, the United States was already the world's largest oil producer. Vast oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and other states supplied an industrial network unmatched anywhere on Earth. When America entered the war in December 1941, this enormous energy reserve became one of its greatest strategic advantages. The numbers were staggering. By the middle of the war, American oil production exceeded that of all Axis powers combined. Refineries operated around the clock, converting crude oil into gasoline, diesel fuel, aviation fuel, lubricants, and countless other products required by modern armies. But production alone was not enough. Fuel had to move from oil fields to refineries, from refineries to ports, and from ports across oceans to distant battlefields. This required a transportation system of extraordinary scale. Pipelines crisscrossed the United States. Railroads carried fuel across thousands of miles. Tankers transported petroleum across the Atlantic, despite the threat posed by German U-boats. Every stage of the process was carefully coordinated to ensure that fuel reached Allied forces wherever they operated. American planners also understood something crucial about modern warfare. An army that outruns its supply lines can become vulnerable, no matter how successful it appears. As a result, fuel logistics became a central part of Allied operational planning. Every major offensive considered not only where troops would advance, but how the fuel necessary to sustain that advance would follow. This emphasis on logistics created a powerful advantage. While German commanders increasingly worried about conserving fuel, Allied commanders could focus on using it aggressively. Mechanized warfare rewarded mobility, and mobility required fuel. The true test of that advantage came after the breakout from Normandy. As Allied armies surged across France far faster than expected, they suddenly faced a new challenge: delivering enough fuel to keep the advance moving. The solution would become one of the most famous logistical operations of the entire war. By late August 1944, Allied success had created an unexpected problem. The breakout from Normandy had exceeded nearly every prediction. Following the collapse of German positions during Operation Cobra, American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces advanced across France at remarkable speed. Cities were liberated one after another, and German units retreated toward the borders of Belgium and Germany. The faster the Allies moved, however, the farther their supply lines stretched. Most supplies were still arriving through the Normandy beachhead. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food now had to travel hundreds of miles to reach front-line units. The advance threatened to outrun the logistical system supporting it. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Allied planners faced a critical question. How could they keep millions of gallons of fuel moving fast enough to sustain the offensive? The answer emerged on August 25, 1944. With the creation of the Red Ball Express, this was not a single convoy. It was an entire transportation network built around dedicated supply routes connecting Normandy with advancing armies. Special roads were reserved almost exclusively for military trucks. Traffic flowed continuously, 24 hours a day. The scale was extraordinary. At its peak, more than 5,000 trucks operated within the system. Many drivers belonged to segregated African American transportation units, whose contributions became essential to Allied success. Working long hours under difficult conditions, they delivered vast quantities of fuel and supplies across France. The most urgent cargo was gasoline. Fuel trucks carried the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Every shipment enabled tanks to continue advancing, artillery to reposition, and transport vehicles to remain operational. Without those deliveries, the Allied advance would have slowed dramatically. German intelligence observed the results with growing concern. Despite destroying bridges, attacking transportation routes, and retreating towards stronger defensive positions, they could not stop the flow. New convoys appeared constantly. Fuel continued reaching the front. The Red Ball Express had become far more than a trucking operation. It was a moving pipeline, feeding an entire army. And for German commanders watching Allied forces race toward their borders, the implications were becoming impossible to ignore. As Allied armies surged across France and Belgium in the autumn of 1944, German commanders began noticing something unusual. The Allies were not fighting like an army limited by distance. Traditionally, military offensives slowed as they advanced farther from their supply bases. Fuel consumption increased, roads became congested, maintenance demands grew, and logistics gradually constrained operational tempo. Yet the Americans seemed able to maintain momentum far beyond what many German officers believed possible. Reconnaissance reports repeatedly described crowded roads filled with transport vehicles. Captured documents revealed extensive logistical planning. Air reconnaissance photographed endless columns of trucks moving supplies toward the front. For commanders such as Walter Model and other senior officers on the Western Front, these observations carried an unsettling message. The Allied advance was not being driven solely by combat power. It was being driven by logistics. Every successful armored thrust depended on a continuous flow of fuel. Every artillery barrage depended on supply deliveries. Every mechanized division relied upon maintenance crews, spare parts, and transportation networks operating behind the scenes. German forces understood these requirements because they faced the same challenges themselves. The difference was scale. While Germany increasingly struggled to allocate scarce fuel reserves, the Allies possessed a logistical infrastructure capable of delivering enormous quantities of petroleum across hundreds of miles. American industry, transportation systems, and organizational planning combined to create a level of operational mobility that Germany found difficult to match. The effect became visible on the battlefield. Allied commanders could exploit breakthroughs rapidly. Retreating German formations often discovered that positions intended as temporary defensive lines were being threatened before they were fully organized. The speed of Allied movement reduced opportunities for recovery and reorganization. German intelligence officers increasingly recognized that fuel convoys represented more than transportation assets. They were force multipliers. Every convoy extended the reach of Allied armies. Every successful delivery increased operational flexibility. Every gallon delivered to the front translated into additional movement, firepower, and pressure on German defenses. And as the war entered its final phase, the contrast between Allied abundance and German scarcity would become even more dramatic. By the winter of 1944, fuel had become one of the most decisive factors in the war in Europe. The contrast between the two sides was becoming impossible to ignore. On paper, Germany still possessed thousands of tanks, aircraft, trucks, and armored vehicles. Yet many of those machines could no longer be used effectively because fuel supplies had reached critically low levels. Entire formations faced restrictions on movement. Tank crews often received reduced training, because gasoline had to be conserved for combat operations. Luftwaffe pilots flew fewer training hours, reducing both experience and readiness. Even when Germany produced advanced weapons such as the Panther tank or the Me-262 jet fighter, fuel shortages frequently limited their impact. The situation worsened after Allied bombing campaigns intensified against synthetic fuel facilities. Production fell dramatically throughout 1944. Transportation networks were disrupted. Fuel depots became increasingly vulnerable to air attack. Commanders were forced to prioritize certain units while others remained inactive. The consequences appeared across every front. During the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge, fuel concerns shaped planning from the very beginning. German forces hoped to capture Allied fuel depots because existing reserves were insufficient to sustain the operation. In some cases, advancing units were delayed or halted because fuel deliveries failed to arrive. Meanwhile, Allied forces operated under entirely different conditions. American fuel convoys continued, supplying armies advancing across France, Belgium, and eventually into Germany. Pipelines such as the Major System expanded logistical capacity even further, reducing dependence on truck transport alone. Fuel flowed continuously toward the front. This abundance created strategic freedom. Allied commanders could maneuver aggressively, exploit opportunities quickly, and maintain pressure across broad fronts. Mechanized warfare rewards mobility, and mobility depends on energy. By early 1945, the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. Germany still possessed soldiers willing to fight, but modern armies cannot move, train, or operate without fuel. And the Allies possessed far more of it than their enemy. Shall I continue to the conclusion? Continue to Section 5, Conclusions. The convoys behind victory. When people remember the Allied victory in Europe, they often think of dramatic battles, powerful tanks, strategic bombers, and famous commanders. Yet many of the war's most important victories were made possible by something far less glamorous: fuel. Every Allied advance depended on it. Every tank attack required it. Every aircraft sortie, artillery movement, and supply delivery began with a gallon of fuel, reaching the right place at the right time. The American logistical system accomplished this on a never before seen in military history. From oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma to refineries, pipelines, tankers, ports, truck convoys, and frontline fuel depots, an immense network worked continuously to keep Allied armies moving. The Red Ball Express became only the most visible symbol of a much larger machine. German commanders understood the significance. They saw Allied armored columns advancing day after day. They watched supply networks recover from disruptions. They witnessed fuel reaching the front faster than German forces could stop it. The tanks were dangerous. The aircraft were dangerous, but neither could operate without fuel. That is why some German officers ultimately viewed American fuel convoys as one of the most powerful weapons deployed against them. Because in the final analysis, the Second World War was not won only by the armies that fought. It was won by the systems that kept those armies moving and rolling across the roads of Europe, often unnoticed behind the front lines, were the convoys that made victory possible.